Hi, everyone. See folks filtering in. Think we'll get started for those of you who are just joining in just a minute or two as we let people come in. See, okay, looks like we're starting to get a critical mass, so I think we can just jump in and get started. Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see folks here. We have a really exciting agenda today. We'll be talking about primarily a new report that Issue 1 just released, but we're going to have a really great conversation with folks from other organizations as well. For those of you who haven't had a chance yet to see this report, we're super exciting about it. It's called Flooding the Gap: How Social Media Companies Empowered Foreign Adversaries During the 2024 Election Cycle. It was co-authored by myself and then Jamie Neikrie, who will be one of our panelists here today. And it was a production of Issue 1 and really showcases, I think, some of our best work at the intersection of both technology policy and election protection. In particular, I think when we wrote this report, there were two narratives that we were trying hard to counter. I think the first being the idea that foreign adversaries aren't an issue in our elections anymore. And I think, they received so much attention in 2016 and 2020 and a little bit less now. And I think one of the things that this report really highlights is that they are just as active a threat. Our adversaries are willing to throw everything but the kitchen sink at our elections, whether that's bot networks, deep fakes and synthetic media, stage content. They help fund domestic proxies. They've created these pink slime websites all over the internet, all with the attempt to manipulate and influence our elections. So I would just say first thing is, really making clear that this is very much still a threat, and the report really documents some of the exact examples of that, specifically from Russia, China, and Iran, but from a number of our adversaries as well. And then I think the second idea that we were really hoping to counter was this idea that big tech has done everything in their power to help protect elections. That's something that they have really come to the Hill and touted, and something that we think is just plain wrong. While there were steps that the platforms did take after the 2020 election, we'll talk about some of those, they really rolled back most of those efforts in advance of 2024. And even those efforts that they took weren't really enough to protect us and set us up well. And hopefully, those of you who have time to read the report, or at least jump to the beginning to the recommendation sections, we really offer concrete suggestions about what could be done. We talk about things like improving platform design, to increasing accountability for the platforms, to increasing public reporting, education, and research on the threat of foreign malign influence operations. But I think that, the second thing we're really just trying to counter is the idea that there's nothing that can be done. Because as you'll hear today, there is so much that we could do as first steps. Well, with that, I think we can sort of start to get started on the conversation. I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Liana Keesing. I'm a campaigns manager at Issue 1. I work primarily on AI, national security, and privacy, among a host of our other issues. Also joining us for the panel is Jamie Neikrie. As I mentioned, we co-wrote this. Jamie is the legislative manager for technology reform at Issue 1. He works to ensure technology bolsters American democracy. He's led efforts to protect privacy, promote platform transparency, enact safeguards for minors, and improve social media design to support democratic integrity. As I mentioned, she's a co-author of this report, which really highlights the urgent need for tech accountability. Before joining Issue 1, he worked on health policy and legislative initiatives in the Massachusetts State House. Ellen Jacobs, who's also here on this panel, is the digital policy manager for ISD US, where she works to mitigate online harms like disinformation, extremism, and hate speech. She advances digital policy and tech accountability goals while engaging with stakeholders, including policymakers, NGOs, and researchers. Previously, Ellen worked at the Omidyar Network on platform accountability and open source technology initiatives. And lastly, we have Nora Benavidez, who's a civil rights and free speech attorney working at the intersection of law, tech, and democracy. As senior counsel and director of digital justice and civil rights at Free Press, she leads efforts to counter disinformation, hate, and online manipulation while protecting digital rights and equitable speech. She has testified before Congress, the White House, and global regulatory bodies, and founded Build the Bench, a network supporting Latina women in law and public service. A past leader at PEN America and the ACLU of Georgia, Benavidez has litigated landmark First Amendment cases and earned national recognition for defending truth and democracy. And I'll really just emphasize, Ellen and Nora have been such great partners to us at Issue One over the past few years of our work. With that, I think we will jump right into it. So I'll pass it to Jamie first to start. I think one of the things and one of the tensions that we tried to highlight in the report is that while the election did produce timely and accurate results, with the problem that there were limited resources, which is something that Issue One's talking about a lot, how do we reconcile the success of the election with the stark vulnerabilities exposed by foreign adversaries that exploited our online information ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, I want to say it's great to be on a panel with Ellen and Nora, who are great work partners for us and whose work really paved the way for the report. Nora wrote a great report called Big Tech Backslide maybe a year ago that helped sort of pave the way for a lot of this work. So I just want to acknowledge that. Look, anybody who has ever done a group project in school knows that the paper you turn in or the grade you get isn't the only metric of success. It's about not only results, but also process and relationships. And when you look at some of those things, yes, timely and accurate results were delivered in this election, and that's a credit to the election officials who were working tirelessly on the ground to make sure that that happened. But those election officials are burnt out and exhausted, underfunded and understaffed. The same is true for tech researchers and others who are trying to flag false information, and the teams even within the platforms. Many of the partnerships between those actors have been eroded or attacked by partisan pressure, which is a huge problem I'm sure we will touch on a number of times throughout this. And then you look at the process and you see tech companies rolling back critical policies and gutting many of their trust and safety teams that were so crucial and that they touted so strongly after 2016 and 2020. And then you see especially how the information ecosystem held up under times of scrutiny or under times of emergency. So if you just take the first Trump assassination attempt, that was an example where many people were grasping for information. They turned to Instagram or TikTok or to Twitter, now X. And a lot of what they were seeing were conspiracy theories or rumors spread by Russia, Iran, and China, things saying that it was an inside job, that it was a planned attempt by the Biden administration, that there were Ukrainian actors behind it. All of these challenges remained present throughout the election. And the fact that we got timely and accurate results doesn't deter any of those threats.
That's great. Thank you, Jamie. And, one of the things you talked about there, and this is something I really want to get into, is, the ways that platforms have really deflected accountability for amplifying so much of this harmful content. And I'm gonna throw it to Nora now, because one of the ways that platforms have done this is they really use the guise of free expression to deflect accountability. They say we're just taking content that other people have, and and we're just dumb pipes. That's as Representative Gephardt often says at Issue One, the platforms just say we're dumb pipes. We don't have accountability. Can you just talk a little bit about how, as sort of tech accountability advocates, we can reframe this debate to prioritize truth and accountability while still protecting constitutional rights?
Sure. Well, it's wonderful to be here with all of you. I think it was a really opportune moment to come in December. We've had a little time to marinate, to let the dust settle. But it will take years for us to fully grasp, as we have seen in previous election cycles, what happened in 2024. And so I'm really eager for us to continue documenting and inquiring as to the state of platform integrity and performance. The age-old argument that platforms and sometimes policymakers use around free expression as a barrier to integrity or accountability, I think are really red herrings. I think those arguments fall flat, and that's fine. There are ways that we can pivot around that. First, I'll mention industry standards in other sectors. social media companies are accountable to and engage with consumers, like so many other sectors. And yes, there is sort of the ethereal, invisible free speech component here. But when you deal with consumers, various sectors must have standards. We have aviation standards, food and drug standards, we have healthcare standards for drugs, you name it. There are various sectors that are required by US law and regulation to adhere to a set of consumer protection guidelines and rules. And so I think there's just this general presumption like, sorry, we really can't do anything, a kind of hand wringing that can occur. And so I sometimes start not even in the First Amendment realm or the free expression realm, but just to identify that it's not uncommon. In fact, it would be the uncommon exception for a consumer-oriented product and industry to be exempt from rules related to consumers. So that's where I always start. And then I say the sort of bigger and more existential question around free expression and content moderation. Mark Zuckerberg recently made an admission, and we saw Nick Clegg speaking to the idea that perhaps they took it too far this election cycle. Like, oops, we maybe needed to roll back our content moderation. And I would say these were terms of service and policies that companies themselves have introduced over the years under pressure and dialogue. This was not being strong armed. Over years following the 2016 election, we saw social media companies increase their own commitment to their proactive activities and written black and white promises to users, saying that they would do a number of different things. And these promises range, the things that YouTube and Google said versus the things that Meta, ultimately branching out with Facebook and Instagram and Threads, they differ. But there are some basic standards like moderating dangerous and violent content. That's something that is at baseline, something all of these companies have largely agreed to. So to now suddenly create a kind of cultural tenor to say it might have been too much obviously speaks to what I think we can look at as the Musk effect, this kind of basement line. And as long as you're not as bad as that, it's okay. And we are up against incredible forces right now to rewrite the cultural incentives that right now would decrease and minimize platforms' desire to do their job, desire to do things that would keep their users excited to come back, keep their users excited to engage, keep brands and advertisers engaged and giving money. So there are lots of reasons to challenge this presumption, but I think we can start with consumer protection guidelines. And then whenever those that want to get into the First Amendment dialogue and debate, there are lots of reasons that we've seen for content moderation being good for users, good for democracy, good for business, good for a bottom line. And we have to find ways to continue rewriting and correcting the record.
Thank you, Nora. And I love everything you said. I think that those are all themes that are really echoed in the report. And this is the part where I make a really obligatory mention to a resource that Issue 1 put out a couple months ago about big tech's broken promises very specifically, because as you said, they made all of these promises. We've cataloged over 130 of them where they said, we are going to take these steps. We are going to do this because they, everyone was talking about all the issues and all the harms that they saw, and big tech made these promises, and now we've seen over and over that they're willing to just renege on them and go back, and the harms are clear and documented. To that end, I think let's zoom out a little bit, because obviously these challenges aren't specific just to the US, right? They are global challenges. A lot of folks, this is the global year of elections. 2024 had more people voting in democracies than around the world. So the things that we're facing aren't just US specific. For this question, I guess we'll start with Ellen, maybe then go to Nora and finish with Jamie. I'm curious, where we've seen successful approaches from other countries that the US could adopt to better address, both foreign influence campaigns, but also platform accountability for these harms more broadly.
Thanks, Liana. And yeah, just to echo Nora, thank you so much for having me here. It's an excellent report, and I think a really great time to sort of be reflective on this huge year of elections and also the deployment of generative AI and so many sort of confounding technologies at the same point in time that I think really kind of put a stress test on already kind of a stress system of platform accountability. I mean, also from that perspective, it's been a really big year as we've watched the Digital Services Act and the EU kind of come into more full enforcement. And we're seeing parts of the UK's Online Safety Act also coming into enforcement. And I think from a US perspective, it's been really helpful to be able to watch not only those regulations being developed, but also implemented now, because we can kind of see from our perspective what works and what doesn't. And I think many of parts of these landmark regulations have been really innovative and have been really helpful in sort of showing the value in things that we've been advocating for here, such as privacy and transparency. And I think two really good examples of this have been first, some of the first transparency reports coming out under the DSA, which are giving officials their really crucial metrics, such as how many content moderators are there per EU language, for each of the platforms. That's just information that we don't have here that is really critical to helping ensure compliance for those regulations, but then also accountability to those populations as well. I also think in the context of elections specifically, ahead of the many elections happening in the EU, the Commission required election stress tests or red teaming exercises with all of the platforms in civil society ahead of those elections. And I think not only is that really helpful in kind of highlighting the risks that we've mentioned and are going to discuss, but also for creating communications channels between those groups and relationships that can be used if something comes up during an election. So I think overall the benefit of being able to watch those regulations being developed and implemented, with also the benefit of being able to figure out how to fit those into some of the specific considerations we have, such as First Amendment protections. So I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Over to you, Nora.
Sure. I'm all about experimentation and innovation, and I'm eager to see the fruits of the DSA transparency reports. I will make one note. I'm always here to throw cold water on everything. I worry about the kind of discretion that companies will have when they answer these mandatory requirements. We've already seen initial examples. Answers that one company provides are 7 pages. The idea being, let's keep it tight, let's give what we have, but at the highest 100,000-foot level, all the way through the notion of burying someone in discovery of hundreds of pages. We've seen other companies provide literally reams of documents and background summary on their practices. So I think it's important that we do test through regulatory and legislative avenues ways to increase transparency and disclosure requirements. It is yet to be seen how those ultimately play out and whether that kind of transparency leads to better dialogue. I worry that we're still in this very adversarial posture of companies trying through whatever tactic to give as little as possible in meaningful ways. And so there's just at like the core of the question around transparency, this incentive and cultural question of why are we at odds when ultimately profit seems to be clearly above people here. We have to reach a point where these companies have an incentive. That's a very difficult question to answer, but I do think that there is a tension there and we're still waiting to see how it plays out. And I think there have been other attempts, not just in sort of the privacy, transparency, or disclosure space. We saw that Australia and now Canada are also trying to figure out what are the negotiation solutions to increase funding for local journalism or non-commercial outlets while creating funnels of revenue from social media companies to provide that. And I'm not sure those have really been successful. What we've seen in Australia, for example, is that one of those measures to create bargaining agreements between social media companies and news outlets has really given a kind of upper hand to the bigger outlets. And the incentive, the idea behind the bill that became law was to help support local journalism. But a lot of the local news outlets in Australia haven't actually seen the money trickle down to them because they just don't have the kind of behemoth negotiating power that big news outlets do. So one of the proposals that I would be so eager to see here in the United States would be for Congress to pass legislation to tax digital advertising and direct those monies to support high quality commercial and local journalism. And we've written about that at Free Press for years. It really straddles our work on journalism policy and in the platform and tech space. I think there are other things we're looking at. I mean, when it comes to solutions, it won't just be legislative or regulatory, though we have spent a great deal of time working with the FTC over the last several years. They just put out a few enforcement and rule actions last week, dealing with the ways that data broker companies are gathering up our data. And those are excellent, excellent steps forward. But we're also seeing litigation that's essential. And so I think at like the umbrella level, mention that solutions are hard to come by in this field. We're still in the relatively early and nascent days trying to identify whether solutions will work and how they will land in the implementation phase. So we need legislative proposals, we need regulatory action and the agencies that have authority to take that action. And then we need innovative litigation. Litigation like what we've seen in Vargas v. Facebook. It's an example where we went after algorithmic discrimination to circumvent things like Section 230. And so in these early days, we're really deploying a lot of different and creative tactics. We have to see how those play out, and it will take years.
Thank you, Nora and Ellen. That was so comprehensive. Jamie, I promised I'd throw it back to you if there's anything else you want to add on the international front, but if not, we can jump on to design changes as well.
I'll only make one other quick comment, which is Ellen mentioned the DSA. The DSA has heightened scrutiny in times of crisis. And we've seen so many crisis points over the last couple of years in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Ukraine, obviously. And it's really important to have what Facebook and other platforms have called break glass measures in those really crucial times. That would have been crucial in the US around the assassination attempt on President Trump or around the hurricanes. So that's just another tool that I want to highlight.
That was great. Yeah. And I think, as Nora mentioned, there's a lot of different mechanisms here, whether we're talking about legislative or regulatory or litigation in terms of action. But I'm curious, when we're trying to imagine what worlds we actually want to get to. The report highlighted how tech platforms design flaws and profit-driven algorithms have created, democracy, created vulnerabilities that foreign adversaries exploit. I'm curious, whether it's through legislative action or litigation or all these other methods, what structural changes do we actually want to see to platform design? What do we think are the most urgent when it comes to preventing those abuses in the future? And for this one, I'll start with Jamie, then go to Ellen and finish with Nora.
Yeah, well, first, I'm glad you framed it as structural changes, because these are changes that need to be built into the design and operations of these platforms. A lot of people want to talk about content, and of course, content is implicated here, but it starts at the design level. So first, I think everybody, I think at this point is well aware that the business model of social media is about engagement. The platforms will send you the most inflammatory content to keep you hooked and keep your attention for longer so that they can sell ads. That's the whole business model. It's why the social media platforms are free. Shifting away from that business model is crucial, or giving users options to shift away, as well as giving users the opportunity to say, I would like to see less of this content and more of this kind of content. Second, I think it's crucial to build friction into the system. So build in ways that we can disrupt the spread of conspiracy theories, of foreign propaganda, before it reaches virality and gets in front of so many people, because we know that it's really hard to unwind false information once people have read it. And you can try to pre-bunk as well. The studies are mixed on that front, but finding ways to interrupt that pipeline, whether it's circuit breakers or other strategies that some of the platforms have already tested, I think are absolutely crucial. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Ellen, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything Jamie said. I think really getting at the business model of the platforms, in which time and time again, and they've proven that they care more about profits than the safety of users, is critical. And, there are lots, to Jamie's points, a lot of discussions have been had over content versus sort of platform design specific changes. I also think getting at the way that the companies operate, there has been massive backsliding in terms of their own staffing of trust and safety teams, of content moderation teams, and a critical part of the way that the platforms have set up engagement for users and relying on users to flag and report violative or graphic content that is still up on the platforms, which is driving this engagement, is hampered when they gut those teams and they don't have experts who can figure out if that content is violative of their own platform policies or other local laws. And they also don't have enough staff available to vet all of those reports, allowing harmful content to remain up on the platform for a much longer time. And I think understaffing of those critical teams to sort of ensuring that, the reporting mechanisms that they claim are critical for sort of flagging this content is a reflection of how little they care about whether or not, they're responding to content that users themselves are saying, we think this is violative of your own platform policies, and it is still up, which can be another element to ensuring that you're sort of breaking that pattern of allowing harmful but engaging content to sort of proliferate on the platforms.
Awesome. And then Nora, finish off with you.
Yeah, trying to differentiate because I think a lot of what Jamie said on design and friction are things I've been really supportive of for a long time. Ellen, I really hear your comments and agree. I think one thing we have to be aware of in the coming years is the dominance and optimism around the use of AI, and that I'll just share a little bit of my experience working with and speaking with some of the platforms. There is an increased and very accelerated movement to adopt automated tools and even generative AI tools to do the work of you name it, to do the work of content moderators, of individual contractors who are reviewing flagged content, to do the work of various review of, let's say, political ads. There are numerous ways that the offsetting of typically and traditionally human tasks within these companies are moving to non-humans, and the notion is that this will be just great, that we can lay off all these folks and AI will take over and it'll be wonderful. And anyone who has seen any number of sci-fi movies knows where that goes. But we also know that humans develop these tools. Well, we all as humans contain biases, and so we need humans to review the kinds of results created by and the results of AI tools when they're being implemented. I think the optimism that tech can save us and that we can AI our way out of whatever thing has been abandoned or humans have been laid off in doing is really misguided. So as we move forward, I think that's really the next North Star, is to figure out what are the structures to create conversation around and push for humans that are in the loop, humans that are reviewing these types of results, and push back aggressively that AI has ultimately proven so far to dumb us down, not actually make us more efficient and more talented.
That's great. And Nora, I love that you brought, oh, sorry, Jamie, you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, if people could leave with one thing from this, it's basically what Nora just said, which is the problems of tech will not be solved by more tech. It's wild how often we have to say that.
Yes, we will emphasize that all day long. And Nora, I love that you brought up AI, because I think there's really two storylines around AI. I think one is on the content moderation side, the use of these tools. Obviously, the other is just the whole idea of 2024 as, the AI election, the first sort of post-truth information environment where, all the content that we saw would be synthetic and generative. I think there are ways in which that played out. I think there are ways in which it didn't, but I do think it's clear that there still are immediate safeguards that are needed to sort of counter the threats posed by AI-driven disinformation. So I'll start with Ellen, but then I invite both Jamie and Nora, if you want to jump in afterwards, to just talk a little bit about what we saw in this election, and also, what your takeaways are from what we saw, the next steps that are needed to really deal with the threat of AI-driven dis and misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a really perfect segue. Nora, I could not have teed this up better myself. But yeah, I mean, there was obviously so much conversation around the rapid development and deployment of generative AI tools this year. I think coupled with a lot of concerns about how is that going to affect the many elections that we were seeing, particularly as many people are relying more and more on the platforms as, maybe their primary or even sole source of news. Ahead of the election, we at ISD put together a scorecard that was evaluating many of the platform's policies that related to elections, including AI. And I think what we saw leading up to the election, and I think was proven true, was that the platforms were really struggling to figure out not only what type of AI content they would allow on their platforms, but how to articulate these policies, which I think led to both a really confusing and fractured landscape for users as they were also trying to navigate, what does it look like to see so much generative or AI generated content on their feeds. We published a piece right after the election that was sort of parsing through some of this, and we saw that content generated with AI really deteriorated people's trust in the information they were seeing, I think, both ways. We gathered a sample of both posts that had been generated with AI and generated organically. And of the posts sampled, people were misidentifying content about 52% of the time. They were often claiming that authentic content was AI generated, and then they were justifying their assessments with flawed OSINT strategies or unreliable online tools. And I think this was in part because the platforms not only had these really confusing policies, but they weren't even enforcing them very well. So in cases where they said they would, label or take down AI generated content about the election, they weren't doing that comprehensively or at a rate that wasn't affecting people's intake of that information or the confusion about whether or not it was true. We looked at 12 widely debunked and publicized AI generated images and videos and still found over 150 instances that were up on the platforms where they had either not been labeled correctly or removed per their own policy. So I think as we're looking ahead to the next election cycle, platforms not only need clearer policies, but they need to be consistently enforcing them because they're creating a situation in which people are relying on platform policies, which should sort of be the guardrails of and rules for content that people are seeing, and just assuming that platforms are adhering to those, and then assuming, if that piece of content they're looking at doesn't have a label, that it wasn't generated with AI, which is not necessarily true. And I think additionally, having better integration of working with developers and AI companies to better and more effectively sort of flag some of those instances where generative AI content is, proliferating on the platforms in high pressure and time sensitive situations like elections is really crucial to better, identifying those pieces and properly labeling or removing them.
Great. Jamie and Nora, anything to add? Okay, great. Well, then we'll jump on a little bit because I think the sort of natural response when it's so clear and you have all of these harms documented, and I think almost everyone has clear stories about the harms of social media in various ways, whether it comes to election or kid safety or all these other issues. I think, the first and natural question is, why hasn't anything been done? Those of you who know Issue One's historical roots know that we were originally a money and politics organization. So I'm going to throw this over to Jamie to answer first because he knows where I want to go. But I also think, there's themes about tech lobbying here. There's some of the things that we talked about in the report were just about partisan chilling campaigns. So I'm going to throw it over to Jamie just to start by asking, can you talk a little bit about what some of those barriers are when it comes to actually dealing with so many of these challenges? And then I'm curious, and I'd love to pass it to Nora and Ellen afterwards, just to talk a little bit about, what it would take to actually overcome these. And I know, Nora, you spoke a little bit about just different methods for, whether it's litigation or all of these different tactics. But I am curious, what everyone thinks it will take to get us past, this idea that big tech just wins over and over and over in the legislative realm, in litigation and all that. So we'll start with Jamie here.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think the fundamental truth is that any person in the tech reform space is going up against the largest and most powerful companies in the history of capitalism. They are using the playbooks that have been honed by big tobacco companies, by big pharmaceutical companies, by big oil and gun companies. and wielding them extremely effectively. People have been probably tracking to some extent the debate over KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, which passed the Senate 91-3, but has stalled in the House. And a lot of the public narrative is that that bill has stalled because of concerns about censorship or concerns about free speech. I want to be very clear that the reason that bill has stalled is because Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Scalise are both from Louisiana, and Meta announced that they are putting a $10 billion data processing center in Louisiana. I'll let you guys connect the dots.
They announced it like a week before this all came up, by the way, just as they were all voting.
Right. So let's be clear on exactly what's happening here. And then at the exact same time, you have this really powerful partisan intimidation campaign that is being waged against the researchers, the academics, the public servants who have been working to combat false information and foreign malign influence operations. Much of that work was created, all of that work was created in a bipartisan manner. Much of it was led by Republicans like Marco Rubio and Rob Portman and John Cornyn after the 2016 and 2020 elections. And there has been a real backlash against that work that has resulted in the US being much weaker when it comes to our ability to fight off foreign malign influence campaigns or even identify them. And that posture is just not going to serve us in future elections. So I think we're sort of weakened on two fronts. We're weakened by members who can't or refuse to act in the face of big tech money. And then we're weakened by these partisan attacks on disinformation defense.
I'll throw it to you, Nora, first. Sort of where does that leave us as tech advocates, and what tools do we have at our disposal?
Yeah. Well, as we are focused on things like documenting foreign interference campaigns, performance and adherence to social media, black and white policies, the executives that run these companies have largely moved on and have come to view their own social media companies as a kind of great extracurricular. It's one of many initiatives that these individuals, these billionaires, operate. And so there's a kind of networked and very wide-ranging set of environments, networked environments that are not being given to us freely, in which we are not the arbiters or free agents to choose how we come to those environments. So our information is really not of our own choosing. And so I think when we try to imagine where this environment leaves us, how we move forward, I'll be honest, I think it's like, telling someone, here's a mop, go mop up the ocean. When you take a tool like that to such a huge problem, it is just overwhelming. And in the forthcoming political environment, the threats are not just that social media companies don't apply their disinformation, or dangerous orgs policy. The threats are now that someone like Elon Musk, as has been alluded in one of the questions I saw we've gotten in the chat, that Musk himself has, catapulted himself into the public and political realm, bankrolling a specific campaign, and now promising to join as a quasi-government actor to, root out inefficiency. Well, inefficiency is a problem, sure, but the methods are what I worry will be incredibly troubling. And so where I am sitting here, I think some of what we have to do is maintain the good work we've been doing, maintain the innovative litigation, maintain and continue to advance good, solid proposals, because the trifecta we see that we are heading into in 2025 will likely and has historically not survived a 2-year period when we have a White House and both chambers of Congress belonging to one party. We've seen it with Clinton, with Bush, with Obama. Like, these typically turn over after 2 years. And so, from just a really tactical perspective, we need to make sure that we haven't been languishing these 2 years in 2025 and 26 with no new ideas, no fresh relationships or ground game. We have to be really, really clear-eyed about, and I think tight on what our strategies will be. So I don't want to present this, mop and ocean environment like there are no solutions, but it is a terrifying uphill battle, and it is one that is becoming increasingly complicated. Complicated as we imagine that Musk might potentially try to privatize the roles that they lay off. Complicated in the ways that some of the other villains are seeking to buy up local news outlets and sort of consolidate narratives, what are acceptable news stories and what are not. The environment is also just so fractured. And so I'll kind of end with, in thinking through how we describe this and how we go forward, I would now say that it's as important in fighting manipulation online to consider the ways that podcasts and other forms of connectivity are just as likely to be the places people go for information as social media. I feel like we're in this very weird moment of transition. And what we saw in the transition from print and radio and cable towards social media is happening again with a whole new crop of 21st century media. So yes, it's important. We're still fighting net neutrality. We're still fighting for connectivity at free press. We still have to be fighting for a lot of the essential baseline safeguards on social media platforms. And we also have to be making sure that we vision out to identify and mitigate against threats in new media environments.
That was great. Ellen, anything to add?
I mean, I was going to say something really similar to Nora, which is like looking at this uphill battle is like overwhelming and like really, really discouraging often. And I think it's important to both recognize that the platforms are hoping that all of their endless lobbying and threatening of, individuals, researchers, civil society groups trying to do this work will dissuade them from continuing to highlight and name the harms to users and ourselves that we see and experience. And I think because social media itself and its problems are so pervasive, but also the fact that these companies have become so powerful and so big, they are now, moving into other industries and affecting them, such as Nora's mentioned, journalism, healthcare, education, that also widens the tent of people who may not at first blush think, oh, I work on things related to big tech. But the thing is, many people do and don't realize. And I also think there's a lot of power in sort of expanding that tent of people sort of and helping them articulate some of these linkages so that we can work a little bit more in solidarity with one another and then sort of, widen the group of people that are working on these issues, which I think has to be one of our answers to just how well resourced the platforms are, is, engaging and bringing more people into this fight, because so many of the issues do affect us, whether or not you use a lot of social media.
Well, I love this idea of broadening the tent. And I think there's ways that, individuals, even as an individual, when you're interacting online, you have your own, set of interactions that drive how you feel about big tech. I think all of us have examples of ways that platforms maybe have gotten worse since we remember them 10 years ago, since we got on them. I'm curious, and Ellen, I'm going to pass this right back to you because I know this was a question that we really wanted to get answered. But just for folks here, who maybe aren't tech advocates per se, but are people who look online and get their information online, what recommendations you would have to help users, to equip themselves, but also, generally what needs to be done to better equip users to successfully parse through information that they're given online?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we keep mentioning it, but I think it's because it's so important that, Platforms have their own terms of service that they publish and are supposed to adhere to. And more often than not, they don't. And that creates a situation in which users are not empowered to know what they are getting themselves into when they agree to enter into like a social media platform or an online space, which really sort of sets them back and puts them vulnerable to many of the harms and risks that we've named. So I think figuring out how platforms should either be, mandated or working with them to incentivize them to follow and adhere to their own terms of service is a huge way to help, users understand what guardrails they're working with when they go onto a platform. I think outside of that, though, the way that we consume information and news has changed so vastly and interact with other people that media literacy is a really important part of this. And I think some of our more traditional avenues of, when you are teaching kids in school about reading, like media literacy isn't necessarily always a part of that, despite the fact that like almost everyone is going to be online and interacting in these spaces. And I think that's also important for adults or people not in sort of traditional education spaces, even just in terms of, developing technologies like AI, which are new and kind of changed the rules of the game, providing those resources, whether it is through, government funding or civil society efforts, or to Nora's point, just one-on-one with other people as you're talking, is really important to helping people sort of figure out what works for them and sort of signs that they can use to figure out, what am I looking at online? Do I trust it? And do I need to look at other sources as well?
Great. Thank you, Ellen. I'm here to do one last reminder that if you have any Q&A questions, get them in now, because in about a couple minutes, we'll be jumping to those. But I want to give our panelists one last question and turn a little bit to a more optimistic note, because I know there's been a little bit of doom and gloom, but I think we've also done a good job offering solutions. I guess I'm curious, a lot of us have lived in this information ecosystem for 10 years now. There's a little bit of, this is just what it's like, right? We go on Facebook, we go on these sites, and they're just filled with stuff, and we have to filter through. Could you, and I'll start with, let's see, Nora, and then go to Ellen, and maybe finish with Jamie. But I'm curious if you could just take, shortly describe, like, what does a healthier, more democratic information ecosystem look like? And, moving from here in the next couple of years, like, what steps do we need to prioritize to get there by the next election? What is your immediate to do, wish list that we need to do to get to that healthier spot? Nora, I'll start with you.
Sure. I was at minimal bleakness. So to hear that we're in a dark place, I was really trying. I can always get way darker. Well, I guess I would start from what we know, and that is dark. So, just stay with me here. I think we know that manipulation, large scale manipulation, whether that's disinformation, hate campaigns, harassment, other forms of, AI, deepfakes, et cetera, you name it, that large scale manipulation environment has ushered in what I would say is a global data sphere marked by a lot of social stagnation. We are less and less connected to each other despite being hyper connected. People have not just echo chambers and silos, but like mini micro bespoke silos where whatever it is you want, you can go down the tiniest and most just excruciatingly narrow micro chamber. This environment has also been marked by democratic backsliding. And in the kind of political alienation environment, we see bad actors exploit that opening to help increase appetite for and oxygen for autocratic values. Musk has been a tremendous and perfect example of how that happens in real time. And so I think when we try to answer what else could we look at, it sounds corny, but I think we have to start with the premise of curiosity and real connection. And some have felt like there is the promise that Blue Sky or other platforms could be the platform for the people. I know that organizations like New Public are also really trying to imagine what would new innovative models for connection look like that are built by people, built by Black women, built by marginalized voices that have been at the very front lines of attack. And so, one, I think we have to elevate those visions. We have to elevate those visions for how we would correct course on the kind of free speech definition we're all consuming and willing to consume, in which, free speech for me, but not for thee. Musk, again, has really helped catapult that into, I think, a kind of regularity and normality. And so we have to be curious, we have to listen, and I think look forward to 4 years from now not being the starting point. There's too much work that gets spun up in election cycle years. And I don't think I'm saying anything that I see Jamie and Ellen nodding. Like they're like, yes, please. Like we all do these calls and it's what, February of an election year? And we're like, let's get ready for the frenzy of groups that haven't been paying attention to this being an election year. And there are groups that are doing this year round all the time, 24/7. Voting rights groups, democracy groups, local grassroots organizations around the world that are trying to give people information, access, and basic rights. So I think like, let's not start from scratch come 2027 and 2028. Let's make sure that a lot of what we're doing, we're tending to our garden, we are finding joy, and we are elevating visions of ways that we can actually lead with the groups and the voices that are at the front lines.
That's great. We'll jump to audience questions in a sec, but I just want to make sure, Ellen and Jamie, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
I think just briefly, I mean, I loved everything that Nora said. I love, like, I do this work because I am optimistic that I think, especially from sort of the civil society and grassroots level, we can do a lot of change and sort of like create a better vision of the internet that is safer and inclusive. And I think articulating and getting, figuring out what guardrails we need to get there is hard but important work. I think just one really quick plug for, transparency. I think Nora's earlier point about the fact that like these social media platforms are not accountable to anyone, let alone their users. And that puts us all at harm and it makes us all more vulnerable. And why should big tech get to grade their own homework? Transparency and being able to widen the tent of people who have this information and can make informed decisions about what, the way that the platforms choose to run their platforms means for users is really integral to sort of widening that tent of people working on this, but also ensuring compliance and accountability for other, things that we pass, such as kid safety or privacy.
Great. And Jamie, you want to
Yeah.
finish this off?
I mean, Nora highlighted curiosity, Ellen highlighted accountability. I'll speak to another sort of lofty ideal, which is truth. I think we have to restore the idea that we can identify and lift up truthful information and highlight and demote not truthful information. We have to trust the experts who monitor and fact check that information, and we have to bring back the bipartisan and cross-sector teams that were doing a lot of that really valuable work. Without that ideal, it's hard to see how we can move forward as a democracy.
Well, we've got the playbook: curiosity, accountability, and truth. You can see why we had these three phenomenal panelists. Thank you to you all. You all did phenomenally. With that, I will pass it off to Willa, and we'll jump a little bit into audience Q&A in the time we have left.
Thanks, Liana. And thank you to our panelists again and our audience for hanging on with us. Sorry to scare you all by just popping into the ether, but I've been here. But I'd love to just give the audience a chance to ask questions. So the first one I will read out is from Isabel, and it reads, "The Musk effect is a growing problem that hints at a growing tech, Silicon Valley and Hill crossover in the next administration. What are the risks of these realms bleeding together, and how can civil society navigate those relationships?" I know, Nora, you spoke to that a bit. I think it would be helpful if you could just talk a little bit more about what you see as the Musk effect and kind of give a more well-rounded response.
Sure. We only have 7 minutes left, and the Musk effect could take hours by
Years.
itself. I think that what we are seeing is the infiltration of individuals and entities that are not expert or steeped in or have the pedigree to work on policy issues right now. And particularly those with the means and the financial backing to enter those realms. Musk himself has long represented more dangerous and wide-ranging efforts, not just entering the political space. You know, I try to talk to, you know, my cab drivers all the time in New York or whatever it is, and people often think and say to me, "Oh, he did such a great job inventing Tesla." Inventing and you name it. There's sort of this premise, kind of like Trump, that he's brilliant, he's, you know, a self-made man. And so I just want to note the hallmarks of these individuals, usually those that promote a kind of autocratic values that I hold dear. Everyone can have, unless I don't like you, unless I don't like what you're saying about me. And Musk has shown that over the years. His buying of Twitter was probably one of the bigger and more, I think, well-known steps that he took into this political and public discourse space. And now his step forward even more aggressively into supporting and being a daily part of the Trump administration is yet another. And it really just kind of solidifies these special interests. I almost call it like billionaires versus the people, you know, those that have the means to architect themselves and their interests so that systems echo their interests instead of echo that of the people. Musk, we have yet to see what will happen. And so I don't want to take up more time. I mean, could just go on and on. What we are looking forward to, what we are already anticipating, is his efforts with Doge. Doge is the Department of Government Efficiency. It's also his little nod to Dogecoin with the acronym, and he has promised to help root out government inefficiency by making layoffs, you know, cutting teams or entire departments. And if he were to do that, he really can't actually become a government actor given his stake in other companies, but he could be a kind of quasi advisor to Trump, who would then make recommendations and ultimate cuts. In doing that, I suspect that that opens up a private sector opportunity where those roles have been gutted in government. And so it's, you know, what can we do about it? I think was the final question here. One, we have to monitor these threats. We have to have legal experts who know when they are overstepping the law. Is Musk engaging in government activity or acting as a government actor when he cannot, given the law? And we then have to have those that are in a variety of avenues and sectors to deploy to challenge these actions. And then I think the cultural note, which is always perhaps the most important, is to just push back on the premise that this is endgame scenario. Like, you know, our government structures and our democratic institutions have held in the past, and there is a lot that Musk himself could not and will not touch. So we have to have a measure of sober awareness that threats are coming, but also that they will not be so pervasive that they touch every single aspect of people's lives.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. I mean, we're almost at the hour here, and I think maybe we could take this opportunity to kind of put a finer point on a lot of the things we touched on today. Maybe Ellen and Jamie can kind of round out how civil society can navigate these relationships between tech and government, or just anything you'd like to add for this incredible discussion this evening.
Ellen, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, I think we've made a lot of really good points, kind of articulating how allowing corporate interests to guide policymakers is only going to continue to ensure that social media companies prioritize profits over the safety of users and the integrity of information we see online. And I think it's kind of, you know, that is at the root of it. That is their business model. That is what it is driving them to make a lot of these decisions that we're seeing the immediate harms of. So getting at that business model through a myriad of the ways that we've talked about today, and getting creative about it, and also continuing to do this work as hard as it is and as discouraging as it can often be, is integral to keeping up the momentum and figuring out what's ultimately going to stick.
Yeah, Ellen highlighted the business model. S.A. Linden's question in the chat about emotional seduction, I think, is a really good term that honestly I might steal. That is at the heart of the business model, is you know, the desire to keep you hooked. Everything Ellen and Nora said is right. The only other thing that I will add is that it is incumbent on civil society organizations to stand strong and band together in the face of intimidation, in the face of censorship efforts. especially given Elon Musk's power, not just on Twitter, but now in this administration. We are stronger together, and we've already seen some organizations, academic and civil society, fold under pressure. It would be a real shame to lose even more. So that's a call to funders, it's a call to actors, it's a call to employees in this space. But we can't abandon, again, the once bipartisan ideal that these efforts to combat foreign malign influence operations and other types of false information are not only valid and bipartisan, but also deeply needed.
Well, I can wrap us up on this front. Just to echo Jamie's last point, like, these are bipartisan and there really are opportunities here. And I think, you've seen today from 3 great panelists who have been doing this work for a long time. I just want to thank the audience again so much for joining, for having you here. Just so you know, the recording will be posted on Issue One's YouTube channel, so feel free to reference back to it there. The report is also available on our website, Flooding the Gap, so please go check that out. It was also highlighted in the post this week, or last week. It's a very exciting shout out. And yeah, one last time, just thank you so much to our panelists, Jamie, Ellen, and Nora. I think there's a lot of insight here, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thanks so much, and have a nice rest of your night.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.